"Ma'am, step out of the vehicle. Now," he said, already reaching for the cuffs, already certain of the story he was about to write. The red and blue lights washed over the quiet street in pulses, reflecting off the polished black paint of the sedan and the thin layer of dust on the roadside curb. And for a moment, everything felt staged, like a scene rehearsed too many times to question. Danielle Brooks didn't move right away. Her hands stayed resting lightly on the steering wheel. Fingers relaxed, nails short and unpainted. Her breathing steady as if the sirens behind her were nothing more than distant noise drifting through a closed window. Officer Ryan Whitaker stepped closer, one hand hovering near his belt, the other already brushing against the edge of the door as he opened it without waiting for permission, the faint scent of asphalt and summer heat rising between them, thick and unmoving. "I said step out," he repeated, sharper this time, and she turned her head slowly, meeting his eyes with a calm that didn't match the moment, a calm that made his jaw tighten just slightly. The street was nearly empty, just one passing car slowing down, a phone already lifting to record, the glow of its screen catching the flicker of the cruiser lights. And somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Danielle stepped out of the car with measured precision, her heels touching the pavement with a soft, controlled sound, her posture straight, shoulders relaxed, as if she were stepping into a courtroom rather than onto the side of a dimly lit street just past 9 p.m. "Turn around," Ryan said, and there was something in his tone, not loud, not aggressive, but practiced, like he had said these exact words 100 times before and expected them to land the same way every time. She complied without hesitation, placing her hands behind her back, and for a fraction of a second, his body camera light flickered, a brief, almost imperceptible glitch, before stabilizing again, steady red against the darkness. He didn't notice. Or maybe he did, and chose not to. The metal of the cuffs clicked softly around her wrists, not harsh, not rushed, just deliberate, and the sound seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, echoing faintly against the quiet houses lining the street. "You're being detained on suspicion of possession," he said, his voice flattening into something official, something detached, as if the words themselves carried more authority than the situation required. Danielle glanced once toward the open car door, toward the interior he had already searched, already decided upon, and then back ahead, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady on a point somewhere beyond the flashing lights. "Officer," she said quietly, her voice even, almost gentle, "you're making a mistake." He let out a short breath through his nose, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, and shook his head as he guided her toward the cruiser. "That's what they all say," he replied, the corners of his mouth tightening into something that didn't reach his eyes. The camera across the street kept recording. The night air stayed still, and somewhere between the hum of the engine and the pulse of the lights, the version of truth he believed in settled into place, clean, simple, unquestioned, while hers waited, silent, unshaken, and far from finished. The back seat of the cruiser smelled faintly of vinyl and heat, the air thick and unmoving as the door shut with a muted thud that sealed the moment in place, and Danielle Brooks adjusted her wrists slightly against the cold metal, not to resist but to settle, to find a position that allowed her breathing to stay even as the engine hummed to life. Officer Ryan Whitaker slid into the driver's seat, his movements efficient, practiced, one hand resting on the wheel, while the other tapped something into the dashboard console, the soft glow of the screen lighting his face in pale blue as the radio crackled briefly before going quiet again. Outside, the neighborhood drifted past in slow fragments through the tinted glass, porch lights, trimmed hedges, a mailbox leaning slightly to one side. All of it ordinary, all of it distant, like a world continuing without acknowledging what had just been set in motion. Danielle watched the reflections instead, the flicker of red and blue stretching across the window, bending with each turn, her own face appearing and disappearing between the lights, calm, unreadable, as if she had already stepped outside of the moment and was observing it from somewhere just beyond reach. "Anything you want to say before we get downtown?" Ryan asked, not looking back, his tone casual but edged with something that suggested he expected a reaction, an explanation, a crack in the composure he had just placed in restraints. She waited a beat, the kind that felt intentional but not defiant, then answered, "I have nothing to add to what you have already decided." The words landed softly, but they lingered, and for a brief second his grip on the wheel tightened, knuckles paling before relaxing again as he exhaled through his nose. The cruiser turned onto a wider road, the speed increasing slightly, tires humming against the asphalt, and the city lights ahead grew brighter, sharper, the silhouette of the downtown skyline rising in the distance like a quiet promise of authority and consequence. In the reflection of the rearview mirror, her eyes met his for just an instant, steady, unflinching, and something about that look stayed with him longer than it should have, a subtle disruption in the rhythm he relied on. He shifted his gaze back to the road, jaw setting, as if dismissing the thought before it could take shape. "You people always think you are above procedure," he said after a moment, the words slipping out more bluntly than intended, and the sentence hung there, unfinished in its implication, filling the space between them with something heavier than silence. Danielle did not respond immediately. Instead, she drew in a slow breath, the kind that steadied rather than reacted, and let it out just as quietly. "Procedure," she repeated, almost to herself, then added, "is supposed to protect the truth, not replace it." The cruiser slowed as it approached an intersection, the red light ahead casting a steady glow across the dashboard, and for a second everything paused, engine idling, lights still pulsing behind them, the world holding its breath at the edge of movement. Ryan glanced again at the rearview mirror, expecting perhaps irritation, fear, something that would confirm the narrative he had already written in his mind. But what he saw instead was composure, intact and unwavering, and it unsettled him in a way he could not name. The light turned green. He pressed the accelerator. And somewhere behind the steady rhythm of the drive, beneath the hum of the tires and the quiet of the cabin, a single detail remained unnoticed, a brief flicker recorded and stored, waiting, patient and precise, for the moment it would be seen. The station doors opened with a low mechanical buzz, and the fluorescent lights inside spilled out onto the concrete like a pale, unwelcoming dawn, flattening every shadow into something sharp and unforgiving as Officer Ryan Whitaker stepped out first, adjusting his uniform with a small, habitual tug before turning back to the rear door, his expression already settled into something official, something that did not leave room for doubt. Danielle Brooks followed without hesitation, her steps measured, the faint echo of her heels against the polished floor carrying farther than expected in the quiet lobby, and for a moment, every conversation seemed to dip just slightly, not stopping, not acknowledging, but shifting, like the air itself had noticed. A desk officer glanced up briefly, eyes moving from the cuffs to her face, then back down to his screen, fingers continuing to type, the rhythm of bureaucracy uninterrupted. "Processing," Ryan said, short and routine, guiding her toward a counter beneath a flickering overhead light that hummed softly, almost imperceptibly, but constant enough to settle into the background of every breath taken in that room. Danielle stood still as instructed, her wrists resting lightly against the edge of the counter, not leaning, not resisting, simply existing within the space as if she had stepped into it by choice rather than circumstance. A camera mounted high in the corner blinked red, steady and silent, capturing angles without context, recording movement without meaning. "Name?" the clerk asked without looking up. "Danielle Brooks," she replied, her voice even, clear, each syllable deliberate, and the clerk paused just long enough for the name to register before continuing, though his posture shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, like something in the air had changed and he had not yet decided why. Ryan set a small evidence bag on the counter, the plastic catching the overhead light, crinkling faintly as it settled, and for a second his fingers lingered on it longer than necessary before pulling away. "Recovered from the vehicle," he stated, tone flat, rehearsed, the words aligning neatly with the report already forming in his mind. Danielle's gaze moved to the bag, then back ahead, her expression unchanged, but her eyes sharpened just slightly, focusing not on the object itself, but on the sequence of moments surrounding it, the gaps, the pauses, the things that did not align as cleanly as he believed. "You are certain that is your report?" she asked quietly, not challenging, not raising her voice, just placing the question into the room like a marker that could not be ignored. Ryan did not answer immediately. Instead, He reached for a form, flipping it onto the counter with a practiced motion, pen already in hand. "That is the report," he said finally, each word measured, as if saying it firmly enough would solidify it into something unchangeable. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed, the distant murmur of voices rising and falling, and the steady hum of the lights filled the spaces in between. The clerk cleared his throat softly and began typing again, slower now, more deliberate, his eyes flicking once more toward Danielle before returning to the screen. A second officer passed by, glancing briefly at the scene, then continuing on, but not before his gaze lingered just a fraction too long on Ryan, as if something about the moment had caught his attention in a way he could not yet explain. Danielle inhaled slowly, the air cool against her lungs, and for the first time since the stop, her attention shifted inward, not toward fear, not toward anger, but toward memory, toward a quiet, persistent understanding that truth did not need urgency to survive, only time. Ryan signed the form with a firm stroke, the ink dark and final against the paper, and slid it across the counter as if closing a door behind him, unaware that somewhere within the system he trusted so completely, a single flicker, barely noticeable, had already been recorded, already been stored, and was now waiting, patient and precise, for someone to look just closely enough to see it. The holding room was colder than the hallway, not by much, just enough for the difference to settle into the skin and stay there, and Danielle Brooks sat on the metal bench with her hands now free, resting loosely in her lap, her posture still upright, composed, as if the absence of the cuffs had changed nothing at all. The air carried a faint scent of disinfectant and old paper, and somewhere above, a ventilation unit hummed with a steady, mechanical rhythm that filled the silence without breaking it. Across from her, a one-way mirror stretched along the wall, dark and reflective, turning her own image back toward her in softened outlines, and she studied it for a moment, not out of vanity, but recognition, as if confirming that she was still exactly who she had been before the flashing lights, before the words spoken with certainty that had no foundation beneath them. Footsteps passed in the hallway outside, measured and quick, then faded, replaced again by the low hum and the quiet weight of waiting. Minutes stretched without announcement, without urgency, and Danielle did not shift, did not pace, did not call out. Instead, she closed her eyes briefly, drawing in a slow breath, and with it came something older than the moment, something rooted deeper than inconvenience or accusation, a memory not sharp but steady, like a photograph kept too long in the same place. A courtroom years ago, smaller, less polished, her father standing at a table that was not meant for him, his hands resting where hers now rested, his voice unheard beneath assumptions already made, already accepted, and she remembered the way he had looked at her afterward, not defeated, not angry, just tired in a way that had nothing to do with time. Danielle opened her eyes again, the present returning with the same quiet clarity, and her gaze moved to the mirror, knowing without seeing that someone might be standing behind it, watching, deciding, forming conclusions from fragments. Down the hall, Officer Ryan Whitaker stood near a workstation, flipping through a digital report on a monitor, the blue light reflecting faintly against his uniform, his jaw set as he scrolled, paused, then scrolled again, as if reviewing would reinforce what he already believed rather than reveal anything new. "You sure about this one?" another voice asked, casual but edged with curiosity, and Ryan did not look up right away. "I wrote the report," he replied, his tone clipped, final, but there was a slight delay before the words came, a fraction of a second that did not match his usual certainty. The other officer leaned slightly against the desk, arms crossed loosely, eyes flicking toward the screen, then toward Ryan. "Just saying," he added, quieter now, "the timing on your cam, it looks a little off." Ryan's hand stilled on the mouse, just for a moment, before he clicked again, minimizing the window, dismissing the detail with a small shake of his head. "Glitches happen," he said, and this time the answer came faster, more controlled, but the words sat heavier in the air than expected, not quite convincing even to himself. Back in the holding room, Danielle's reflection shifted slightly as she adjusted her shoulders, the faint scrape of fabric against metal barely audible, and she exhaled slowly, not in frustration, not in fear, but in patience, the kind that does not rush to correct what is wrong because it understands that truth, when left alone, has a way of surfacing on its own. The overhead light flickered once, briefly, then steadied again, and in that instant, unnoticed by most, a system in another room processed data quietly, frame by frame, storing, aligning, preserving a moment too small to matter to anyone who was not looking closely enough, yet precise enough to change everything once it was seen. The clock on the wall ticked with a soft, steady rhythm that seemed louder in the stillness of the holding room, each second stretching just enough to be noticed, and Danielle Brooks kept her gaze forward, not fixed on the door, not fixed on the mirror, but somewhere in between, where patience lived without effort. The air had not changed, still cool, still carrying that faint sterile scent, but something beneath it had shifted, subtle, almost invisible, like pressure building behind a closed surface. Down the hall, the workstation screen glowed brighter as a new window opened, lines of footage loading frame by frame, and Officer Lena Morales leaned slightly closer, her brow tightening as she scrubbed back a few seconds, then forward again, her fingers slowing, then stopping altogether. "Hold on," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else, and the cursor hovered over a moment that did not align, a flicker that lasted less than a second, a gap that should not exist. Ryan Whitaker stood a few feet away, arms crossed, posture controlled, but his eyes shifted toward the screen despite himself, drawn by the silence that followed her voice. "It is just a glitch," he said, the words coming quickly, almost automatically, but Lena did not respond right away. Instead, she zoomed in, isolating the frame, enhancing the contrast, and the image sharpened just enough to reveal what had been hidden in plain sight, the angle of a hand, the placement of an object, the sequence slightly out of order, like a sentence rearranged to mean something else entirely. "Glitches do not rearrange motion," she said quietly, her tone calm but firm, and that was the moment. The room changed, not loudly, not dramatically, just a shift in weight, like something tipping past the point of balance. Ryan uncrossed his arms, stepping closer, his jaw tightening as he looked at the screen, and for the first time since the stop, his certainty did not arrive immediately. "You are reading too much into it," he replied, but the conviction was thinner now, stretched, and Lena leaned back slightly, her eyes moving from the footage to him, measuring, not accusing, just observing. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe I am reading exactly what is there." The hum of the station seemed louder now, the distant voices sharper, and somewhere a printer began feeding paper with a soft, repetitive motion that filled the space between words. Back in the holding room, Danielle shifted her hands slightly, fingers brushing against each other in a small, grounding movement, and her eyes lifted toward the mirror again, not searching, not questioning, simply present, as if she could feel the change without needing to see it. A door opened down the hall, footsteps approaching, more than one set this time, slower, deliberate, and the rhythm of them carried something different, not routine, not casual, but intentional. Ryan remained by the screen for a second longer, his reflection faint in the glass of the monitor, and in that reflection, something had altered, not fully broken, but no longer untouched. Lena saved the clip, labeling it without comment, her fingers steady, precise, and as the file transferred into the system, it settled there like a quiet truth, waiting not to be created, but to be acknowledged. The footsteps drew closer, the handle to the holding room door turning with a soft click, and Danielle inhaled once, slow and even, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, because somewhere beneath the layers of assumption and authority, the truth had already begun to move, and it did not need her to chase it, only to stand still long enough for it to arrive. The door opened with a soft metallic click, and the sound carried into the holding room like a quiet signal that something had shifted beyond the walls, not sudden, not dramatic, but deliberate, and Danielle Brooks lifted her gaze just slightly, her posture unchanged, her hands still resting loosely together as two figures stepped inside, their movements slower than before, measured in a way that suggested this was no longer routine. Officer Lena Morales entered first, her expression composed but focused, a thin folder held firmly in her hand, while another officer remained just behind her, silent, observing, the air between them carrying a weight that had not been there earlier. "Ms. Brooks," Lena said, her voice calm, respectful, and the difference in tone was immediate, subtle but unmistakable, and Danielle inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, not surprised, not relieved, simply present. "There has been a development," Lena continued, pausing for a fraction of a second, as if choosing each word with care, and the faint hum of the overhead light filled the space between them, steady, grounding. Down the hall, Officer Ryan Whitaker stood alone now, the workstation screen dimmed behind him, his reflection faint in the dark glass, and his hands rested at his sides, not clenched, not relaxed, just still, as if waiting for something he could no longer control. The earlier certainty that had shaped his posture was no longer there in the same way. It had not vanished, but it had shifted, thinned, like a structure beginning to show its fractures under pressure. Back in the room, Lena opened the folder, the soft rustle of paper breaking the silence, and she placed it on the small metal table beside Danielle, turning it slightly so it faced her. "We are reviewing footage from the stop," she said, and Danielle's eyes moved briefly to the folder, then back to Lena, her expression unchanged, but her attention sharpened, focused not on the words themselves, but on what they implied. "There appears to be an inconsistency," Lena added, her tone steady, and the word lingered in the air, understated but precise, carrying more weight than its simplicity suggested. Danielle drew in a slow breath, not out of tension but clarity, and nodded once. "I understand," she replied, her voice even, and there was no triumph in it, no urgency, only recognition, as if she had been expecting this moment not because she had forced it, but because she had trusted it would arrive. In the hallway, a pair of officers passed by more slowly than before, their conversation muted, their eyes flicking briefly toward Ryan before continuing on, and that brief glance said more than any words could, a silent acknowledgement that something had changed, that the narrative was no longer as fixed as it had seemed an hour ago. Ryan shifted his weight slightly, his gaze moving toward the holding room door, then away again, as if avoiding a reflection he did not want to see. Inside, Lena closed the folder gently, her fingers resting on its edge for a moment before she spoke again. "We are going to need a formal statement," she said, and Danielle nodded once more, the motion small but certain. "Of course," she replied, and as she stood, the faint scrape of the bench echoed softly behind her, the sound clean, final in its own quiet way. The overhead light flickered once more, then steadied, and in that steady glow, the space felt different, not warmer, not safer, but clearer, as if something invisible had been brought into focus. Outside the room, the system continued its quiet work, aligning frames, preserving sequences, and piece by piece, the truth that had been interrupted was restoring itself, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a precision that did not require permission, only time. The interview room was quieter than the holding area, the kind of quiet that carried intention rather than emptiness, and Danielle Brooks sat across from a metal table with her hands now free, resting lightly against the surface, her fingers still, her posture composed as a small recording device blinked red between her and Officer Lena Morales, marking each second with silent precision. The overhead light cast a steady glow, not harsh but unforgiving, revealing every detail without distortion, and Lena took a seat across from her, placing the folder carefully on the table as if the weight of it mattered more than its size. "This is a formal statement," Lena said, her voice measured, professional, but no longer distant, and Danielle nodded once, her gaze steady, acknowledging the process without resistance. "Please describe everything from the moment you were stopped," Lena continued, and for a brief moment, the room held still, as if waiting to see whether Danielle would rush, defend, or unravel, but she did none of those things. Instead, she began slowly, her voice calm, each word deliberate, not shaped by urgency, but by clarity. "I was driving northbound," she said, her tone even, approximately 30 miles per hour, within the posted limit, and the details unfolded with quiet precision, not embellished, not minimized, simply stated as they were, her memory structured not by emotion but by sequence. Lena listened without interruption, her pen moving occasionally across the page, capturing key points, but her attention remained fixed, focused not just on the words, but on the consistency behind them, the absence of hesitation where doubt might have been expected. Down the hall, Ryan Whitaker stood near the doorway, not inside, not fully removed, his presence lingering at the edge of the process he had initiated, and he watched through the narrow window, his expression controlled but no longer certain, as Danielle's voice carried faintly through the closed space, steady, unbroken. "He asked me to step out of the vehicle," Danielle continued, "and I complied." And the simplicity of the statement seemed to settle heavier than anything more dramatic could have, because it left no room for interpretation, no space to reshape it into something else. Lena glanced briefly at the recording device, then back at Danielle. "At any point," she asked carefully, "did you observe the item before it was presented as evidence?" Danielle paused, not long, just enough to consider the question fully, and then she answered, "No," her voice unchanged, and that single word carried a weight that shifted the room almost imperceptibly. In the hallway, Ryan exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for a moment before lifting again, drawn back despite himself, as if searching for something that would restore the balance he had relied on. Inside, Lena leaned back slightly, her pen resting against the paper, and she studied Danielle for a brief second, not with suspicion, but with recognition, as if seeing not just a subject of a report, but a person who understood the system from both sides of its design. "Thank you," Lena said quietly, and she reached forward to stop the recording, the red light fading to dark with a soft click that marked the end of the statement, but not the end of what had begun. Danielle remained seated for a moment longer, her hands still, her breathing steady, and then she rose with the same measured control she had carried from the very beginning, not reacting to the shift around her, but moving with it, as if she had always known that truth did not need to raise its voice to be heard, only to remain consistent long enough to be seen. The hallway felt narrower now, not in space, but in tension, as Danielle Brooks stepped out of the interview room beside Officer Lena Morales, her footsteps measured, steady against the polished floor, while conversations nearby softened into murmurs that carried just enough distance to avoid direct attention, yet not enough to ignore entirely. The station had not changed, the same fluorescent lights, the same muted hum of machines, the same quiet rhythm of paperwork moving from one desk to another, but something beneath it had shifted, subtle and undeniable, like a current running just below the surface. Lena walked slightly ahead, the folder still in her hand, her expression focused, her pace unhurried, and Danielle followed without hesitation, her posture unchanged, her gaze forward, not searching, not avoiding, simply present in the movement of the moment. At the far end of the corridor, a glass door reflected their approach, their figures stretching slightly with each step, and in that reflection, Ryan Whitaker stood waiting, not blocking the path, not stepping forward, just there, his presence no longer commanding the space the way it had before. His shoulders were still squared, his stance still controlled, but the certainty that once defined him had thinned, replaced by something quieter, less certain, something that did not settle as easily. As they drew closer, Lena slowed slightly, her attention shifting toward him, and for a brief moment, the three of them shared the same space without speaking, the silence holding more weight than any exchange could have carried. Ryan's eyes moved from Lena to Danielle, and then back again, as if searching for confirmation, for contradiction, for anything that would restore the narrative he had built, but what he found instead was stillness, composure, and something else he could not name. "We are continuing the review," Lena said finally, her voice calm, direct, not confrontational but firm, and Ryan nodded once, a small motion that carried more restraint than agreement. "Understood," he replied, though the word did not land with the same solidity it once would have. Danielle did not speak, her gaze passing over him briefly, not with judgment, not with accusation, but with a quiet clarity that seemed to see through the surface of the moment and into something deeper, something he had not expected to be seen. The air between them held for a second longer, then shifted as Lena moved past him, opening the glass door with a soft push, the hinges releasing a faint sound that broke the stillness just enough to let the moment continue. Beyond the door, another office waited, quieter, more contained, and as Danielle stepped inside, the light changed slightly, warmer, less stark, casting softer edges across the room. Behind them, Ryan remained where he stood, his reflection faint in the glass, distorted slightly by the angle, and for the first time since the stop, he did not move to follow, did not step forward to reclaim control, but stayed still, as if the space itself no longer responded to him in the same way. Inside, Lena placed the folder on a desk, opening it once more, her fingers moving with quiet precision as she arranged the pages, aligning them carefully, as if preparing something that required not speed, but accuracy. Danielle took a seat without being asked, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her breathing steady, her presence unchanged, and in that steadiness, the room settled around her, not because she demanded it, but because she did not disrupt it. Outside, the system continued its silent work, frames aligning, sequences restoring, and piece by piece, the truth that had been interrupted was no longer waiting in fragments, but beginning to take shape, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that did not require belief to exist, only recognition to be seen. The room felt quieter than before, not because the sounds had disappeared, but because every detail now carried weight, every movement measured against something unseen, and Danielle Brooks sat across from the desk as Lena Morales turned the monitor slightly, angling it just enough for her to see, without fully exposing the screen, a gesture that balanced transparency with procedure. The video paused on a single frame, grainy but clear enough, the outline of a hand, the angle of a door, the placement of an object that did not belong where it appeared, and Lena's finger hovered just above the keyboard, as if the moment itself required permission to move forward. "Watch closely," she said, her voice low, steady, and Danielle leaned in slightly, her expression unchanged but her focus sharpened, not searching for confirmation, but for sequence, for truth in the details that others might overlook. The footage resumed, slow at first, then frame by frame, and the flicker appeared again, brief, almost invisible, but this time it did not pass unnoticed, it paused, expanded, clarified, revealing the subtle break in continuity, the shift that could not be explained by chance alone. Danielle did not react outwardly, did not inhale sharply or shift in her seat, but her eyes held the frame a fraction longer, absorbing it, placing it within the larger pattern she had already begun to understand. "There," Lena said quietly, freezing the image again, and the room seemed to tighten around that single moment, as if everything before and after it had been leading here. Outside, beyond the closed door, Ryan Whitaker stood at the far end of the hallway, no longer pretending to be occupied, his attention fixed on the space he could not see into, his posture still controlled, but his breathing slower now, heavier, as if the weight of something unspoken had begun to settle into him. Inside, Lena leaned back slightly, her eyes moving from the screen to Danielle, studying not just her reaction, but her restraint, the absence of urgency where most would have reached for it. "This changes the timeline," Lena said, more to the case than to the person in front of her, and Danielle nodded once, a small, precise acknowledgement, as if she had been waiting not for validation, but for alignment. "It restores it," Danielle replied softly, her voice even, and the distinction hung in the air, subtle but significant, because it was not about altering what had happened, but about revealing what had always been there. Lena exhaled slowly, her fingers tapping a key that saved the frame, archived it, secured it within the system that had begun to shift around them, and as the file locked into place, it felt less like a discovery and more like a confirmation. The overhead light flickered once, then steadied, casting a consistent glow across the table, the monitor, the still image frozen in time, and in that steadiness, the room settled into a new balance, one that did not rely on assumption, but on evidence. Danielle leaned back slightly, her hands returning to rest in her lap, her posture unchanged, her presence as calm as it had been from the beginning, and Lena closed the folder slowly, her movements deliberate, as if acknowledging that the process had crossed a threshold it could not return from. Outside, the hallway remained quiet, but the silence had changed, no longer neutral, no longer passive, and somewhere within. The system, the sequence of events had been rewritten not by force, but by clarity, each frame aligning with the next until the truth no longer needed to be argued, only recognized. The room did not feel the same anymore, not because anything visible had changed, but because certainty had shifted places, and Danielle Brooks sat in stillness as Lena Morales closed the final file on the monitor with a quiet click, the sound small but definitive, like a line drawn without announcement. The overhead light remained steady, casting an even glow across the desk, the screen now dark, reflecting faint outlines instead of evidence. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, not out of hesitation, but because the next step no longer required explanation. Down the hall, a different kind of movement had begun, quieter, more contained, yet heavier in intent, as two senior officers walked past the main station area, without slowing, their eyes forward, their presence enough to shift conversations into silence without a single word exchanged. Ryan Whitaker noticed them before they reached him, his posture straightening instinctively, the familiar rhythm of authority returning for a brief second as he turned to face them, but it did not settle the way it once had. It did not anchor him in the same certainty. "Officer Whitaker," one of them said, his tone even, controlled, and Ryan nodded once, a short, professional acknowledgement, though his gaze flickered briefly toward the office door, where Danielle remained inside. "We need to speak with you," the second officer added, and there was no urgency in his voice, no raised volume, just a firmness that did not leave space for negotiation. Ryan inhaled slowly, the breath measured, deliberate, and he followed without resistance, his step steady, though something in the cadence had shifted, a slight hesitation that did not belong to him before. Inside the office, Lena remained standing by the desk, her hands resting lightly against its edge, and she turned toward Danielle, her expression composed, her voice quieter now. "The review is being escalated," she said, and Danielle nodded once, not surprised, not relieved, simply acknowledging the progression of something that had already begun. "I understand," she replied, her tone unchanged, and there was a stillness in her presence that did not demand outcome, only process. The hallway outside grew quieter as doors closed one by one, the sounds of the station folding inward, contained, as if the building itself was holding its breath. In a smaller room further down, Ryan sat across from the same kind of table he had stood beside countless times before, the surface cool beneath his hands, the chair less comfortable than he remembered, and for the first time, the perspective had shifted in a way he could not control. The questions began simply, structured, precise, each one aligning with the sequence that had already been established, and he answered them as he always had, clearly, directly, but between each response, there was a fraction of a second, a pause that had not existed before, a space where certainty used to be. Back in the office, Danielle remained seated, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her gaze steady, and she did not look toward the hallway, did not seek confirmation of what was unfolding beyond the door, because she did not need to witness it to understand it. The system had already aligned, the sequence restored, the truth no longer fragmented but whole, and it moved forward now without force, without noise, simply because it could not remain hidden once seen. The overhead light flickered once, then steadied again, and in that steady glow, the room felt clearer, not changed, but revealed, as if everything that had been uncertain before had simply been waiting for the moment when it no longer needed to be questioned. The station had grown quieter in a way that did not feel temporary, as if something within its walls had shifted into a new alignment, and Danielle Brooks remained seated in the office, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, while the world around her adjusted to a truth that no longer needed to be uncovered, only processed. The clock on the wall moved forward with the same measured rhythm, each second landing softly, but now each one carried consequence, not urgency, and Lena Morales stood near the window, her arms loosely crossed, watching the faint reflection of movement in the glass rather than the hallway itself. "They are documenting everything," Lena said after a moment, her voice calm, almost quiet, as if speaking too loudly would disrupt the balance that had finally settled into place, and Danielle nodded once, her gaze resting on the desk in front of her, not distant, not distracted, simply present in the moment. As it unfolded, "They should," Danielle replied, her tone even, and there was no trace of satisfaction in her voice, no indication that she viewed this as a victory, only a recognition that the system was doing what it was meant to do when it was allowed to function without distortion. Down the hall, behind a closed door, Ryan Whitaker sat with his hands resting on the table, his fingers no longer still, but shifting slightly against the surface, a small movement that betrayed the tension he had not yet acknowledged aloud. And across from him, the same measured voices continued, steady, precise, each question aligned with the evidence that had already begun to define the space between them. "Can you explain the sequence here?" one voice asked, not accusing, not confrontational, but exact, and Ryan looked at the screen in front of him, the paused frame illuminated in sharp detail, and for a moment, the words he had relied on before did not arrive in the same way. "It is a malfunction," he said finally, but the sentence did not settle. It hovered, incomplete, and the silence that followed it was longer than expected, heavier than it should have been. Back in the office, Danielle rose slowly from her chair, the movement unhurried, deliberate, and she walked toward the window, stopping just short of the glass, her reflection faint but clear enough to recognize, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady. Outside, the evening had deepened, the sky shifting into a darker shade, the streetlights casting soft pools of light onto the pavement below, and the world beyond the station continued as it always had, unaware of the quiet shift taking place inside. "You handled this differently than most would," Lena said, turning slightly toward her, and Danielle's reflection moved with her, calm, composed. "Most would push," Lena added, "or react." Danielle considered the words for a brief moment, then responded, her voice soft but certain. "Reaction does not restore anything," she said. "It only changes where the damage lands." The statement settled into the room, not as a lesson, not as a correction, but as something observed, something understood through experience rather than explanation. In the hallway, a door opened again, the sound echoing softly, and footsteps moved with a different rhythm now, slower, more deliberate, carrying the weight of a process that had reached its turning point. Ryan remained seated as the file in front of him was closed, the soft sound of paper aligning marking the end of one phase and the beginning of another, and for the first time, he did not look toward the door, did not seek the hallway, but kept his gaze on the table, as if recognizing that the space he occupied had changed in a way he could not step out of. Inside the office, Danielle stepped back from the window, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her breathing steady, and she did not ask what would happen next, did not need to, because the sequence had already been restored, and once restored, it moved forward on its own, not driven by force or emotion, but by the simple, undeniable weight of truth being seen for what it was. The air inside the station had settled into something quieter, more deliberate, as if every sound now carried consequence, and Danielle Brooks stood near the doorway of the office, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, while Lena Morales reviewed the final set of documents with careful precision, aligning each page as though the order itself mattered as much as the content. The overhead light cast a soft, even glow across the desk, no longer harsh, no longer flickering, and the room felt clearer, not because anything had been added, but because something had been removed, the uncertainty that once occupied the space now replaced by something more defined. "This will move forward to formal charges," Lena said, her voice calm, measured, and Danielle nodded once, her expression composed, not reacting to the outcome, only acknowledging it, as if she had never needed the result to validate what she already understood. "I appreciate the process," Danielle replied, her tone even, and Lena paused for a brief moment, her eyes lifting from the file to study her, not with curiosity, but with quiet respect, recognizing the absence of bitterness where it might have been expected. Down the hall, the atmosphere had shifted further, conversation subdued, movement slower, as Ryan Whitaker stepped out of the smaller room accompanied by two senior officers, his posture still upright, his steps controlled, but something within him had altered in a way that could not be corrected by discipline alone. He did not look toward the main area this time, did not scan the room for familiarity, but kept his gaze forward, as if the path ahead no longer required his direction, only his presence. The soft echo of his footsteps followed him down the corridor, each step measured, each movement contained, and the weight of the moment settled not in what was said, but in what no longer needed to be defended. Inside the office, Lena closed the final folder, the sound gentle but final, and she placed it at the edge of the desk, her hands resting lightly on its surface for a moment before stepping back. "You are free to go," she said, and the words carried no ceremony, no emphasis, only truth, simple and direct. Danielle inclined her head slightly, a quiet acknowledgement, and turned toward the door, her movements as measured as they had been from the beginning, her pace unhurried, her expression unchanged. As she stepped into the hallway, the station seemed to adjust around her, not dramatically, not noticeably to those who were not paying attention, but enough that the space felt different, more aware, more aligned with the reality that had taken shape within it. Ryan passed at a distance, their paths crossing for a brief second, and neither of them stopped, neither of them spoke. But in that moment, something unspoken moved between them, not accusation, not apology, just recognition, the quiet understanding of what had been revealed and what could no longer be undone. Danielle continued forward, her steps steady, her gaze fixed ahead, and as she reached the exit, the door opened with a soft push, the cool evening air meeting her as she stepped outside, the city lights stretching out beyond the station in quiet continuity. Behind her, the building remained, unchanged in structure but altered in meaning, holding within it the sequence that had been restored, the truth that had surfaced without force, and the silence that followed not as absence, but as resolution. The night air felt different once she stepped outside, cooler, lighter, carrying none of the weight that had settled inside the station, and Danielle Brooks paused for just a moment on the concrete steps, not to look back, not to reflect, but to breathe, slow and steady, as the distant sound of traffic moved along the street like a quiet reminder that the world had never stopped. The streetlights cast long, soft shadows across the pavement, stretching outward in steady lines. And a car passed by at a normal pace, its headlights sweeping across the front of the building before disappearing into the distance, leaving behind nothing but the hum of its engine fading into silence. Danielle adjusted her jacket slightly, her movements calm, unhurried, and began walking toward the curb, her steps measured, each one landing with the same quiet confidence she had carried from the very beginning. Behind her, the station doors opened briefly, then closed again, the sound soft but final, and inside, the rhythm of the building continued, altered but intact, the process moving forward without needing to announce itself. Somewhere within those walls, files would be reviewed, statements documented, decisions formalized, but none of that required her presence anymore, because the part that had depended on her had already been completed, not through force, not through resistance, but through something quieter, something stronger. A black sedan waited at the curb, its engine idling softly, and as she approached, the driver stepped out, opening the rear door with a small nod of recognition. No words exchanged, no need for them, and Danielle inclined her head in return before stepping inside, the leather seat cool beneath her, the door closing with a muted sound that sealed the moment behind her without erasing it. The car pulled away slowly, merging into the flow of the city, and through the window, the station grew smaller, its lights blending into the surrounding buildings until it became just another structure in the distance, no longer the center of the moment, no longer the place where truth had been held back. Inside the car, Danielle rested her hands lightly in her lap, her posture unchanged, her gaze forward, and the passing lights reflected softly across the glass, moving in steady patterns that did not demand attention, only presence. She did not check her phone, did not speak, did not replay what had happened, because she did not need to. The sequence already complete in its own way, the truth already standing on its own without requiring her to carry it further. Across the city, in a different building, a courtroom would stand ready, silent, structured, waiting not for emotion, but for clarity, and when the time came, it would receive the same steadiness she had brought to every moment before it, not as a reaction, but as a continuation of who she was. The car moved through a green light, the signal shifting behind them without notice, and the road ahead opened into a quiet stretch of evening traffic, smooth and uninterrupted. Danielle exhaled slowly, her shoulders settling just slightly, not from relief, but from completion, and her eyes remained forward, steady, as the city unfolded ahead of her, unchanged, yet somehow clearer. She had not raised her voice, had not forced the outcome, had not become what had been placed against her. And in that restraint, something had shifted far beyond the walls she had just left, something that did not need to be seen to exist. She did not change the system that night. She did not reshape the world beyond it. But she had held her ground with a quiet certainty that allowed the truth to surface on its own. And sometimes that was enough, because it reminded the world, even if only for a moment, what it looked like when justice was not demanded, but simply allowed to be.